Welcome, everyone, to Season 5, Episode 9 of Solarpunk Presents. Today, I'm talking to Michael DeLuca. He's the publisher of Reckoning, which is a magazine of creative writing on the environment. And he also runs the independent bookstore Waitlist Books. And today, we're going to be talking about older technologies that Solarpunk could maybe adopt and work with in ways that are, not quite so take it out of the box and just use it, but are far more flexible and far more imaginative, and that we could get a lot of stuff done with in a sustainable way. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited for this.
I'm really excited to talk to you because rumor has it that you have a book that's about to come out.
Yes, I do. It's called The Jaguar Mask. It comes out in August. I'm not sure you could say it's Solarpunk in that it is set in the now or very near future, but it sure is about environmental justice. So I think there's a lot of overlap.
And where can people find this book when it comes out?
Stelliform Press is the publisher, and their website is stelliform.press.
All right, everyone. At this point, the first reviews have come out for the Jaguar Mask from places like Solarpunk Magazine, and they're all really, really positive. To give you a couple of quotes here, it's a surreal fantasy novel. It's a superbly humane take on being a living myth inside a world whose preferences lean toward violent lies. It's a new novel for the Solarpunk revolution. It's a page-turner. Takes off on page 1. It doesn't slow down. It's fast-paced. It has sumptuous prose. It's steeped in the colors, sounds, and scents of Guatemala, weaving a veritable shape-shifting tapestry. Yet the reviewers have loved this, so there's a good chance you will too. Until August 1st, you can put in a pre-order for the book. After August 1st, you can just simply order it. I'll put a link to Stelliform Press and to the book in the show description, so be sure to check that out. So now we're going to talk about technology, because Michael has some ideas about old tech that Solarpunk might appropriate, and I'm really curious as to what he means by this and what kind of tech he wants to talk about.
There's so much here. I want to talk about all kinds of tech, and I'm curious to find out what we'll get to. I've just been listening to an episode of your podcast where you talked about blockchain and things like that.
The episode from hell.
Yes. And I listened to it. I chose that one specifically to prepare for this because I was curious to see how you dealt with that.
Yeah, not very
I really
well.
Appreciate. I think the conversation itself sure did miss some key aspects of the way technology functions, but I really liked your preamble very much. So thank you for doing that.
For those of you who didn't catch that, after the outcry over how badly I handled that episode, I added a little preamble at the beginning to try to put everything into perspective. So if you haven't listened to that preamble, you can go ahead and check it out. It's now at the beginning of the episode.
And it's a wonderful set of principles to react against. And then shortly after that, I saw that you had on, I'm going to mangle his name, Pavel and Jay. And he's someone who I've been aware of in Solarpunk for a few years now. And his attitude is similar to mine towards the way tech has been developing. I have a degree in computer science that I got in 2001, and there was a brief period while I was getting that degree when I had a great deal of optimism about the future of tech in the way that I think of tech bros having it now about things like blockchain and cryptocurrency and NFTs and AI. None of those things were available then, but I was hopeful and excited to speculate about the future. And I hadn't heard of Solarpunk and wouldn't for some 15 years after that. But in the intervening time, I worked for 1 year for a software developer and experienced the way that all works and hated it and quit. And then only now am I sort of looking back on that with other than pure regret. I've gained a little bit of perspective on what that experience taught me about how all these other technologies have developed. And Pavel spoke about the ways we fail to perceive the structure through which things like apps are developed and AI is developed. I'm discovering now, looking back on that 1 year, that one of the things that annoyed me and made me want to leave was the encouraged insularity of the individual within that system. So huge company trying to develop a thing that I personally was never going to see. I would never see the end product. I would never fully understand how the whole thing worked. I was given a little piece. When you're developing something that is intended for humanity, or the cross-section of humanity that is technologized, which is a small cross-section, but developers think as though they're directing themselves at everyone. And I got a little bit of that from that interview from Hell, that the perspective there was narrow in ways he wasn't noticing. In my undergraduate experience learning to be a programmer, I had already acquired an interest in knowing the whole way from bottom to top what a computer is. I was taught what bits were. I was taught what assembly language was, which is a very low-level programming language that no human engages with anymore, because we've built all these conceptual frameworks on top of it to hide the assembly language, which are the instructions directly to the hardware that consist of zeros and ones.
If I could just interject something here, I'm always fascinated by the fact that people develop and then also have to study computer languages, which is our way of accessing of running computer or interfacing with the machine language, right? And so people don't actually always fully understand how these languages will work. Or maybe, and that's my outsider perspective on this.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's considered a good thing. So I've got these tech skills from 2001, which are quite outdated. And I'm lucky enough that tech is not a monolith, and that there's 8 billion people on this planet, and whatever it is, 40% of them who even have access to a phone have all these different ways of interacting with it.
Christina, with her fact checker hat on, breaking in to say this one's a difficult one, because you can find pretty much anybody saying anything on the internet about what the right number is. There are reports that say that the mobile phone penetration into markets is basically 100% at this point. And then there's others that say that actually there's only about 5.6 billion as of like January 2024 unique mobile phone numbers, and that's about 70% penetration worldwide, and that about 5.3 or 5.4 billion people use the internet at the moment. So that's about 66%, which is also very close to the number of different social media user identities. Although, of course, some people have multiple accounts there. So, yeah, you're on your own with the accuracy of this particular number, I'm afraid. But I will put a link to a report in the show description so you can check it out. And now, back to the discussion.
My book is set in Guatemala. I've spent a bunch of time in Guatemala, and I've seen the difference in the way Guatemalans interact with not just computers, but cars. In Guatemala, they get all these expired school buses from the US and other places, and they refurbish them and work on their engines in ways no American would be interested in doing. And then they transform them into this communal transportation system that is incredibly cheap, not terribly safe, but super fun, and it works. So they're operating entirely on cast-offs from the global north. And the same thing is possible in tech. Just as an example, in the 2010s, there was a startup developing these tiny clamshell laptops that could be crank powered to give away in Africa, where people didn't have access to technology. They were these super low-end things that had a command line and didn't need a power grid to function. Unfortunately, there were some colonialism inputs to the way that the people developing those little clamshell computers thought they were going to be used, and I don't think they ended up having a great deal of adoption.
Christina breaking in to say, so I think Michael is talking about the OLPC, the one child per laptop that was supposed to be sold for $100. And I will put a link to an article about this in the show description, so be sure to check that out. Okay, now back to the discussion.
And they'd also come up with this very strange new metaphor for how files were to be stored and regarded on this machine that was different from what everyone else was doing. It was a bit more like the cloud now, and it was intended to hide the way the machine actually functioned from the people using it. It was in hope of making it accessible. But I think because it wasn't like what everyone else in tech was using, it didn't interface with the cast-off technology that people in those places were already trying to adapt, and so it sort of fell flat.
Gosh, how long do you have to crank a computer to be able to use it for a reasonable amount of time?
Excellent question. A lot. I was working at Small Beer Press at the time, and I convinced them that this was a fun idea, so we did this process where we got one, and some 10-year-old somewhere in Africa got one, and I got to play with it. It was intended to be very low power draw, which is great. But for someone who was accustomed to the power draw of the global north, it was a bit frustrating for me.
I can see what problem it's trying to solve, which is give computers to people who don't have a reliable electricity grid. But yeah, so you give someone something that is a lot of work to crank up, and then, as you say, isn't compatible with all the other stuff that's going on. So what can someone actually do with a computer like that?
Right. They can do word processing, learn to type.
Mm-hmm.
It was delightful. The keyboard was specifically designed for kids, so like I had to cram my little fingers to get it to work. It was a really exciting idea, and I was sad that it didn't play out. But then it's been quite a few years since then, and I'm on let's see, this is probably my 4th laptop in my life. And the previous 2 are in Guatemala now, serving, I hope. Probably one of them has died, but at least the previous one, I have some hope, is in the hands of a Guatemalan teenager being used for good. That's the angle I now have on old tech. You know, that's part of the angle. I've got this same perspective on bicycles. I love bicycles. I am somewhat behind on cutting edge bike technology. I've experimented with an e-bike, but I don't have an e-bike.
Oh, you're young yet. You're young yet.
Oh, right. Yes, I anticipate absolutely when I become disabled, as I expect to do eventually, that an e-bike will be an absolutely wonderful thing for me to explore.
Although I have to admit, when I was back, my parents live in Los Angeles, and I was back there last summer doing a lot of driving because I had to deal with all sorts of family catastrophes because, yeah, they're all in their 80s. And I was shocked by the number of teenagers who were driving around on these e-bikes. You don't even have to pedal them. You know, these like big, fat, chunky tires. They're very cool looking and they're fast. And, you know, they were faster than I was in traffic. And they are so mobile, these teenagers, without having to have a car. And so I was really, really impressed with that.
It is wonderful. It's been a process of adaptation. I live in the Detroit area now, and there was some question in Michigan as to whether they would allow e-bikes on bike trails because of that added power. Then this classification system has come into existence, and I don't even know what they all mean. Like class 1 is a certain level of power and speed, and class 3 is something more approaching a motorcycle. And there's different levels of danger and risk with each of those, and it makes more or less sense to share a space intended for pedestrians. But every aspect of e-bikes seems inherently in keeping with the principles of Solarpunk to me, because it's providing mobility to people who wouldn't have had it otherwise. Even people who live around me who own huge SUVs and guzzle gas and probably energy in other ways occasionally get excited to ride their e-bikes around. And that's a step forward, I think.
It's a really quiet revolution in some ways.
Is.
Like if people can see, oh, this gives me so much freedom and it's so easy and I don't have to find a parking place. And then if you get enough people on the road, then you have to improve the bike lanes and then suddenly you have a lot less traffic. I mean, I was originally very skeptical about e-bikes, but this opened my eyes to them being a fabulous thing. And all my neighbors have them and they wouldn't otherwise ever ride their bikes. So, okay, they mostly do it for exercise, but
It's so great how exactly the thing you described, where it's so fun, people just seem eager to adopt them, that there's a groundswell where in most other aspects of climate advocacy, everyone is very frustrated because we need top-down legislation to say, you know, no more cars that get less than 40 miles to the gallon, arbitrary number. But with e-bikes, the swell is coming from the bottom, and they have to put in bike lanes because otherwise it's going to be more dangerous for everyone. And yeah, that's really great to see. However, there is the aspect of the cycling industry that resembles the computer tech industry in that it is dominated by the rich. The new technology is being developed for the rich, at least to some extent, maybe not with the stratification that you see with cars, but the people down at the bottom of the pyramid who are inheriting the old bikes aren't really being thought of. And I'm thinking of those people, and I'm delighted about all this, about the way that that same groundswell can be used to pick up a bike out of someone's trash, oil it, and now you've got mobility.
Yeah, it is a
I'm
little
doing
more
that.
complicated with an e-bike. So
Right.
my mother-in-law inherited an 8 or 10-year-old e-bike from her sister-in-law, after her sister-in-law passed away. Well, this thing sat in a shed for a while until the nephew handed it over to my mother-in-law. And at that point, of course, the battery's dead. And to find a replacement battery was not so easy on a bike that was 8 years old. So we finally found a Dutch company who would take the casing and would pack in new batteries into this so that you could still use the old charger and all of that. But it was expensive. Not as expensive as buying a new e-bike, but also difficult. And also you read that, a lot of times you do this with a fly-by-night company over the internet, and you end up with batteries that then catch very easily on fire, and then people are charging them overnight while they're sleeping. In the front hallways, or right by the where you would have to leave in the event of a fire. And this is also this is bad. I mean, okay, these are all solvable problems, but you have to know what you're doing, and you have to know these problems exist.
Right. And here we come back to the do people understand how technology works and what does that mean question. We don't know how our phones work.
Yeah, that's kind of my definition of technology. Is anything I don't
Things
understand
you
how
don't
it
know how they
works.
work.
I'm
uh, it makes me
only
think
slightly
of,
joking. Mm-hmm.
right. It makes me think of steampunk and of things like the world, the future envisioned by some old RPG video games and Japanese manga about this like future economy where people rebuild their robots out of old buried parts that they find lying in a ditch somewhere. And that was always a delightful world to imagine and play in. I feel like Miyazaki has some of that with his airships and a tiny bit with bikes. And, that's predicated on a world where this technology has been around so long that a lot of people do know how it works. So, you've got the mythical retired roboticist who lives in the desert and has this vast collection, this junkyard of old robots that he can help you rebuild this thing, which to you seems magical because you've grown up in this post-industrialized society where these things weren't available to you. That kind of future seems available to us now. Here in Detroit, Detroit has been massively economically disadvantaged for decades and is coming back now in some ways and is not in other ways, but every neighbor I have makes my knowledge of cars look hilariously tiny. I hate cars. I hate car culture. I have all these criticisms of how societies are built around them instead of around humans. But it's amazing to see people applying ingenuity from the scrap heap in that sense. It would be so great to be able to think of people in a few years, once e-bikes have been around for a generation, developing that kind of facility. I don't have the knowledge of e-bikes to say how interchangeable these things are going to be, but even now I'm reading a book that says how to do that with human-powered bikes, how to apply different standards and adapt, put in spacers to your chain ring so that you can put it on a new bike or things like this.
Yeah, I mean, people
That
who are really into bikes have been really into building their own bikes, and replacing the various different components. I've never been good at that. I'm really impressed with all these cargo bikes. Okay, they're very expensive, but they're also really people are coming up with some really, really cool designs, and yeah, and so you're starting to see people do more grocery shopping on their bikes, or plonking their pets or their kids in the cargo section of the bike and biking
it
down
is
to the
wonderful.
beach.
My sister has
Um,
one of those. Yes, she has 3 kids and is successfully able to transport them around in it
yeah, and
for
that
a short
feels
time until they grow too big, I think.
Yeah, but that feels so much safer than, the little trailer with the flag on it that you're dragging behind your bike, right? Or I don't know. I mean, what do I know? I've
I
never
mean,
tried
right, it
either, but
provides you the power provides you the ability to compete with and escape from cars as necessary. That's
hmm
the safe aspect, I think. As someone who is sort of stubbornly working with the older stuff, I have a trailer. I have one kid. He's 7 and is just growing out of being able to fit in that trailer. But I cannot give that trailer up because I use it to get groceries. I use it to get lumber occasionally. I use it to buy plants. I wouldn't know what to do without it anymore. And it's just me, pumping my legs and having I have been biking for my 80% of my life. So I have a sense of where I can avoid the danger of cars and to what extent. And that really helps me use my kid trailer as if it's a cargo bike. And I realize that that's not something that everyone can easily do. Just as I see people here in Detroit who would have been expected to learn how gas cars work, seeing the writing on the wall and learning how solar panels work and how electric cars work, I can hope that we all, or some cross section of us, those who need it, can develop this knowledge of bikes and perpetuate a functioning society after some of these technologies, which are just too energy intense to continue using, must go.
okay, so you mean like generative AI and cryptocurrencies, or what do you
Yes.
mean? Or just driving in general?
Yes. I know you're in Germany, and I'm sure when you look out the window at cars, you see a specific set of cars, which I hope it doesn't include Ford F-150s, which is what I see when I look out the window. My dad has one. I had a chance to drive it, and it was horrible, a terrible experience. I couldn't understand why someone would have conceived of this enormous thing when something so much smaller is so much more functional. And those are the kinds of things that, yeah, we absolutely have got to move away from. The hope I see around me lies in the way the people who are 4 steps down the chain from the brand new F-150 buyer are adapting to keep their 1990 Toyota Corolla functioning.
Cars used to be something that a person could fix.
Mhm.
You just had to be into it and figure it out, and you could take out the carburetor, blah blah blah. And you could actually mechanically see how things worked, and on some level, it makes logical sense, right? But now you need a computer to diagnose what's wrong with a car. So, well, okay, not everything, but for a lot of things. And so a normal person can't really fix a car anymore.
And this is, I'm not sure about the censorship rating of your podcast. Can I say the word enshittification?
Yeah, it's fine. I
Um,
think as long as every other word isn't blue, it's all right.
this is a word coined by Cory Doctorow, which keeps growing new facets daily for me because they want to put AI in everything. And before that, they wanted to put internet connectivity in everything. And by they, I mean the people steering the tech industry. We see, Teslas with self-driving capability that's just what it's called. It's not self-driving capability at all. And because they've called it that, people think it is that, and threats to human life ensue. It's something that I see writers around me looking at AI, seeing the hideousness, the exploitativeness, and rejecting it, and not having the technical background in order to perceive avenues that they can take away from it. And that makes me sad. But it also seems like an opportunity because I have that background. So I can tell people you can buy a refurbished laptop from 10 years ago, and it won't have AI on it, and it'll work because computers have not actually improved in the sense that we were told they would. Since the advent of the internet, we were told that processing capacity would double every 2 years. I forget there's a term for this principle.
Yep. Moore's Law.
Around the late aughts, I believe, is when that started to no longer be the case. And the way they shoehorned it into still applying was by putting more and more processors on a board and shrinking the components, while they were also making all the processing less efficient and require more energy and more processing power. Finally, now we have this word which applies. There are a few places I can find that it doesn't apply. And I think everyone else is going to have no choice but to see it, because AI is so baldly not what it says on the tin that there's a bit of excitement to see how everyone is going to open their eyes and say, well, if this is a crock that's been fed to me, what else?
Yeah, I think AI is a way, is really it's a way for a small number of people to control and manipulate the rest of us. Like, it's that on steroids. But so a computer from 10 years ago, so you'd have to run this off Linux.
Well, I'm speaking to you currently on a computer from 2011.
Okay. And so what operating system are you using?
It is using Mac OS High Sierra 10.12. It's starting to go out of compatibility with some things, but because I'm adaptable and have these skills, Mac OS is built on top of Unix, and so Unix and Linux are pretty friendly, and there are all these tools available that have been developed in the open source community, which still exists despite having been largely co-opted by the more corporatized tech. I keep finding new tools that give me hope that I'll be able to keep adapting this old clunker to function as far as I think it'll be necessary to function. This week, I am noticing even more acutely that internet search just isn't what it used to be.
Oh, it's useless now.
It's useless now. And I...
Partly because the internet is also just a heap of paste and copy at this point. Christina, the producer, breaking in to say, Christina, the host of this episode, paste and copy? What on earth? Copy and paste. Okay, now back to the discussion.
Right. There's so much non-information. There's so much that is intended only to waste your time for a few fractions of a cent in ad clicks.
Yeah, so, I think we used to call enshittification, we just used to call it entropy. And I think the system is hitting its maximum entropy phase.
Right. Too much complexity. Yeah. And there's certainly analogies to natural systems. There's the example that I love of, I think it's an island somewhere in the Great Lakes where this is completely apocryphal and I'm remembering something, so please don't quote me, but where during World War I, someone, possibly the U.S. military, got the idea that they should stock this island with deer as a emergency food source. So they put a few deer on this island, and then fast forward 20 years, and the deer have multiplied, devoured every single other living thing on that island, and then all died. So now it's a barren wasteland.
Yeah, that's ecology for you.
Right.
Christina breaking in with her fact checker hat on. So on the one hand, he could be describing a very classic paper, maybe in ecology, about boom and bust cycles. It's very common with deer populations, especially since there's no more wolves anymore in a lot of places, and they tend to basically they live somewhere, they eat as long as they can, and they grow and they grow and they grow. As long as they have adequate food resources, then they hit the limit, and then there's starvation, and they die off, and they get sick as well because they're weak, and then everything slowly has a chance to regrow, and then you get these boom-bust cycles. But there is also something I found in an Anchorage newspaper about a reindeer herd that was put on an island by the U.S. Coast Guard. And they also went from being like 26 animals within a period of 6 years, they became something like 6,000. and then they hit the wall for, the food resources on this little island, and they pretty much all died out. Although that might have had something to do with a really bad winter as well. But anyways, there was a huge population crash because there was suddenly no more food for the reindeer to eat. And I'll throw a link to that newspaper article in the show description. So check that out. Okay, and now back to the program.
And that it's like a stark and very simplified example, but humans are a natural species as well, and we depend on resources in the same way. And
yeah, we forget that. We take a lot of this for granted. All of this for granted.
And we're sure encouraged to do so by things like our phones.
Yeah, so I think the people who are building the phones and selling the phones and making all this stuff, I don't know that they mean it. I'm not even sure they really get their part in all of this. We also just say, okay, I like my phone. It's shiny. It's fun. I can scroll through it and see pretty pictures, and we just don't really think about things. But what you're doing with your 10 or 11-year-old laptop here, or 12-year-old, 13-year-old laptop, it's hard work. And you have to, deliberately, you have to know why you want to do that. You have to know whether or not that's compatible with all the things you want to accomplish on your computer. I mean, I'm just thinking of publishing. I'm thinking if you're delivering, if you're submitting stories or novels anywhere and you're submitting in anything less than some of the more modern versions of Word, the publishers don't even know how to deal with that. They are definitely not tech people, is what I've discovered.
True. There is absolutely an interface point that I must negotiate. And when I bring this up with other people, this comes up every time. I'm aware of that. And so I have heard you speaking about how Solarpunk seems extremely optimistic, overly optimistic, that it fails to perceive these kinds of limitations. And I absolutely agree. And so you hear me getting excited about the idea of resorting to 20-year-old software to get around modern problems. And I am excited, but I'm laboring under no illusions that this is a way that the entirety of human society can continue to function.
It's a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure most people are up to it. But I mean, I guess that's the whole point of Solarpunk, is that, you create these communities where, or, in theory, more than in practice, I guess. There's this idea that you could create these communities where people say, do I want this kind of tech? Do I want that kind of tech? And then to intentionally decide what you're going to have and how it's going to work, and to recognize what the trade-offs are. And that's what you need in order to have control over these things. But then, you run the risk of becoming like the Mennonites or the Luddites, or right, to become this pocket of people who's, I don't know if left behind is the right word, but maybe doesn't necessarily have a widespread effect on how everything's being done in the world, because it just becomes this self-contained thing.
I do perceive that risk, and I do see some aspects of the Solarpunk community making that mistake, growing more insular. And there's a real risk for anyone. The echo chamber thing that we were all worried about with the internet 10 years ago hasn't gone away. However, humanity is so varied and so vast, and the top-down solutions, as we all know, are frustratingly difficult to accomplish. They're needed, desperately, desperately needed, but publishing Reckoning and editing Reckoning and interacting with all those writers shows me daily, again and again, the need for morale. It's so easy to despair, and from despair comes fatalism and inaction. Hope is the antidote, and that's part of what Solarpunk is trading in. And Solarpunk and something that was called Hope Punk came up at the same time in speculative fiction for a very good reason, I think. And hope only goes so far, but it's needed. In the process of searching for that, I have found these communities who are still living within the society that would be leaving them behind, still functioning and trying these new things. I think that both provides hope, and it provides all these avenues of action. And thought to develop further. Another thing you have talked about on this podcast is why is the word punk in there? And I have an answer about that, which is that punk, as I understand it, the original punk represented counterculture, which is a thing that I am told we no longer technically have in the world, that counterculture as a binary with culture is a thing that no longer exists because the internet has provided for all these microcultures. So now what we have is 1,000 countercultures that may not necessarily talk to each other. Each one of those can be operating according to a punk ethic, resisting that society that's going to leave them behind. I think the concept of being left behind may at the very least need to be taken with the grain of salt that who decides which direction is forward. I haven't heard you discuss, but maybe you have, the concept of degrowth.
We haven't tackled it, and I think we need to do a little bit of research to do it justice. But it's interesting because it's, most people think, we would instantly dive into a depression and people lose their jobs and everyone would be poor and go hungry. But, my understanding of it is that you could attain degrowth just by shifting your spending away from things that produce growth and towards things that support people. Instead of supporting banks or whatever, then you support people who work in care homes, that kind of stuff. So, and so
Yes,
that you
absolutely.
actually, then you have, the economy keeps going, but you don't have to keep growing it. You don't have to keep producing things. You don't, and so you can shrink the economy while maintaining a high standard of living and, or, a good standard of living for everyone just by shifting the focus of where you're spending your money as a government.
I think that people, when they are reacting that way, must be thinking about it from a top-down perspective. They must be thinking a sudden, abrupt change in the whole trajectory of human productivity and economy. That seems so far-fetched to me. Like, I too thought this way for a while, but as I grow into the idea and look at it in the context of everything else I'm doing, it seems more like that metaphor of turning the Titanic away from the iceberg. It turns really slowly and maybe it doesn't get far enough, but at least it didn't plow straight into that iceberg. All these somewhat isolated communities who are, in fact, incredibly connected via the internet, no matter how enshittified it gets, I think the thing that will cause it to continue functioning as an internet is us individuals communicating with other individuals like I'm doing with you right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so however small the momentum is, I personally, am trying to degrow and it's going okay. I look at my peers and I restrain from criticizing their life choices because that's a non-starter. But I see how much less it seems like I consume. I know lots of other people like me who are trying to do the same. And eventually, whether it's fast enough to avert utter disaster is subject to question, but it's a way forward.
There has been research on this, and there was a paper that came out, I think, earlier this year that suggested that in the global north, we would have to cut back by, I would have to look up the numbers, but it was something like 40% of the GDP, since the GDP is very closely linked to like carbon emissions, cut back by 40%. Is it to 40% or by 40%? I think it's to 40% of our current GDP by 2050. Christina breaking in to give you the actual numbers from this paper, which was published in Nature in 2021. One way that we could reduce our carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions fast enough to avoid 1.5 degrees of global warming by the end of the century, or, at least to have a good chance of succeeding at that, is by significantly decreasing the amount of energy we consume, which is something that is very, very tightly correlated to GDP. So that would also decrease the GDP. So this would be a major degrowth scenario. So the numbers are: the global north could reduce its energy demand by 53% by 2050. The global south which is still developing, also needs to get into the game, although there is some room for its energy use to go up before it goes down. But basically by 2050, it needs to go down by 32%. This adds up to a global reduction in energy use of 40% by 2050, and that would deliver enough cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to, again, give us a good chance to avoid more than 1.5 degrees C of global warming during this next century. And of course, this is a major degrowth scenario because the GDP and carbon emissions and energy use are all very, very tightly coupled because you have to burn energy to have productivity, basically. And right now, burning energy or using energy means burning fossil fuels. Okay, now back to our discussion. And as an individual, I can totally see that being possible for myself. On the other hand, I'll also be quite old by 2050, and I'm not going to be flying anywhere, and I'm not going to be doing all these things, and I'm not going to be buying very much stuff. And then I think the developing world also, they get a few more years, and then they also have to cut back a little bit. And then that would, in principle, get us to net zero by 2050. Again, I haven't read this paper in a couple of weeks, so I don't remember the exact details. Yeah, except that I think the degrowth has these two sides, and one is this stopping consuming, and the other is spending money instead on supporting people. So it does also need the government to come in and redirect things, the government spending a bit. Because the way to avoid your economy going into a major depression and people being miserable and poor when you stop burning a lot of energy and you reduce your GDP and so because you're no longer producing things, is if you've shifted your economy over to one in which people are paid to take care of other people and do lots of creative work and performing arts and basically just make the environment a better one for people to live in because it's more enjoyable and everyone is supported. Instead of living in an economy where the whole point is to produce goods and enrich a couple of people at the top. So, but it is an interesting idea, and I think we definitely do need to talk about it on the podcast once we've done a little bit more research and found a good person to talk to about it. Someone who's, probably in the academic sphere doing actual research on it and can speak with authority on how it could be done without crashing the economies.
I would very much like to hear that because, yes, it's a concept that I hear a lot about.
Well, and most people have an allergic reaction to it.
In the same way that they, here in Detroit, people really like their gas cars. Of course, everyone loves their phones with good reason. They provide cat videos. What could be better than cat videos? And yes, there is great complexity to this. Of course, people are creatures of habit, and the ponderousness of change sure is. I think it is the cause for things like the sudden proliferation of the far right all over the world.
Oh yeah. That's a that's a whole other issue. That's a whole other many issues. Well, what's interesting though is that there are great technological changes that just get picked up and adopted, and people run with them, and they don't complain at all. And then there's other things where people just completely freak out, and it's not really clear to me how one ends up going one way and another thing ends up going another way, like phones, for instance, right? People love that. And the electric car, I thought people would totally go for electric cars, but this one they're having a hissy fit about, and I don't get that one. So or heat
it's
pumps,
fascinating to think about the sorry, what was your third example?
Or heat pumps. Like, I don't understand.
Oh, yes.
So people around here are like, you're gonna pry my oil burner out of my cold dead hands, and you're just like, hey, get a heat pump. It's cheaper. It's cleaner. It's so much cheaper. I mean, once you pay for it, at least. I mean,
right. Yeah, gas-powered stoves also. I'm very puzzled why everyone thinks that's so great. I really want to inhale fumes for the rest of my life. So that I can cook an egg slightly faster.
It was a marketing campaign. Now we're cooking with gas, right? That got people right, and it just entered the social consciousness or the social psyche. And there it is.
That's what I was the direction I was gonna take a minute ago. To think about the Star Trek concept of the communicator and how it was used versus the phone and how it is used. The communicator inspired the cell phone, apparently.
Oh, not Maxwell Smart's shoe phone.
I'm sure that did too. But You don't see anyone on Star Trek sighing and having to click out of ads in order to get to the essential science content that explains how to fix the warp drive. The industrial system by which these things are developed is predicated on profit, profit, profit. And thus, all that stuff is baked in. That's why we have any of this. And to think of a completely different system, I mean, I think of space exploration and the innovations that has been responsible for. And that's more of a let's inspire people. Let's spend a ton of money inspiring people while also secretly using it to build up the military industrial complex and make a bunch of people rich. So it's not like that's a completely different path, but it's is it different, or am I fooling myself? I wonder. Do you have an opinion?
Oh, yeah, this is a whole other big topic. I think we somehow become allergic to having the government spend money on anything, including research and development, not just social programs, but so even though we're really big on spending for the military, let me ask you a question. Actually, you've been very good at interviewing me here. Let me turn the tables and interview you and ask you about one. So we've talked a little bit about bicycles and a little bit about computers and older cars, but what's another piece of older technology that you think Solarpunk could adopt and do things with?
Trains comes to mind, but that's of course a completely different kettle of fish over here in the northern hemisphere. I mean the Western hemisphere than it is for you folks. It requires infrastructure.
Oh, even here
I,
they need to build more train infrastructure. So,
I mean, I think agriculture. There's
mm,
lots of things that are not called technology or thought of as technology, which I somewhat recently learned to think of in that way. I recently read a book about the cuisines of Mesoamerica prior to European contact, and corn is an oft used example of a technology that was developed, 8,000 years ago, absolutely through a technical and scientific process, and which no one thinks of that way. And that
yeah, it was really
process,
hard to domesticate.
right, right. And the thing that corn is now is a completely non-viable plant. It depends utterly on humans, and we depend on it, and we don't think about that. As a result of industrialization, agriculture has become what it is, where now we're like, oh, can we use corn to power spaceships? But there's all these rungs on that ladder that anyone could step back to and go off in a different direction. In Guatemala, there's like 40 kinds of banana that I had never seen in my life until I got there, and they're all delicious. Probably the reason we don't see them here is because they don't travel well, or for various other reasons. It's not as easy to grow them in vast plantations.
It's amazing
And
that we've let a small number of companies make all of these decisions about what we eat. I don't know,
right,
where's the outrage on that? I think we'd all be in the streets screaming about that. But somehow as long as we have food and we go to the grocery store and it's, reasonably priced, then we're okay. We're fine with it.
are you all having terrible inflation there? Because we're having terrible inflation here.
It
So
was really bad, but it seems to have sort of, as far as I can tell from doing the grocery shopping, it's gone back down. So,
good. I am
um,
relieved to hear that, and hope I could look forward to something similar. But I wonder, I was just listening to an interview with a climate policy guy in Pakistan who was talking about how they're going to have 125-degree summers from now on, and no
yeah.
plant on Earth can survive those conditions. And he was saying we really have to develop plants that can survive in those conditions. But while we're doing that, there's going to be food shortages. And I have to assume that at least temporarily, some foods will get really expensive. And every time that happens, it will be some kind of wake up call.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, yeah, I feel like the next 20 years are terrifying. I feel like the next 5 years are terrifying.
hmm.
We just don't, we haven't realized that we were already falling off the cliff. We're like the coyote before he actually plunges.
Right. Yes.
Um,
Soon our eyes will get big and we will
yeah,
acknowledge physics.
yeah. No, I mean, the other scary thing about agriculture is that right now, 40% of the human race, we wouldn't be able to feed them if we didn't produce artificial fertilizers. That's how, and so that is also very energy intensive. The process by which you take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into ammonia is not easy. It was developed it was developed in the early 20th century. And yeah, like as I said, without it, half of the human race would not be here today.
And yet that commodity is used so inefficiently. It just flows right off the fields and into the waterways and poisons things and
Oh yeah, well
changes the pH of the
oh.
ocean.
Yes, don't even get me started on that. I live in the middle of farm country and it just, I thought I would move out here and I thought I would develop Stockholm syndrome, like I would sympathize with the farmers, but every year I live out here, the angrier I get about the way they farm. It is devastating. It is absolutely devastating. And they refuse to change. I mean, they're also up against the wall because they're not getting paid enough for the food they produce, but this is a whole other issue. Yeah, no, I think the human race is marching into a perfect storm of disastrous problems just because we've been able to get away with doing things. And now we're in the situation where we have this maximal number of people and everything about everything we do is about to get harder because of climate change. And yeah.
Yes. So, right. The alternative to intentional degrowth is enforced degrowth.
Yeah.
And we're staring down the barrel of that.
Yeah, well, and also with the here in Germany, we have a huge problem with labor shortages because the baby boomers are retiring and there's nobody to take their place. So there's not enough plumbers, there's not enough electricians, there's not enough doctors, there's not enough nurses, there's not enough school teachers, and everyone wants to be an internet influencer. But ultimately there's just not enough people to do all of these jobs because the age structure is so weirdly skewed. And it's a real problem and it may actually cause degrowth. Simply because no one can get work done.
And then concurrently with that, there's the horrible reaction against immigration and refugees.
Yes.
Which would seem to present a solution to some of those problems.
Well, and after World War II, it did present a solution to some of those problems, although unfortunately it went hand in hand with a lot of racism that still hasn't worked itself out of the system. So, but I think we've strayed far and wide from our initial thought about adopting old tech. So if you had one piece of advice for people, for an easy bit of old tech that they could adopt to avoid some of the enshittification, what's the one thing you would advise? Would it be a bicycle or yeah, trying to get an old refurbished laptop or what?
Placed on the spot, I would definitely say a bicycle because they are so frequently just out by the side of the road being thrown away. But maybe a more practical but unfortunately less attached to a physical object way to frame this would be to sit back and think about how your grandparents did things outside of the context of the social progress we've made. Think about what they knew how to do, what resources they operated on. I'm thinking about acquiring more how-to books because my grandfather was able to fix anything. As far as I was aware, he seemed magical to me, and none of that knowledge was passed to me. I relied too heavily on him for things like that, and now he's gone. And so I feel that I should figure these things out. And so I wasn't thinking so hard about the open source software developing community of 15 years ago until very recently. I wasn't thinking deliberately about how I really need to know how to fix bikes until a few years ago. Not in any one field or direction particularly, but just the idea to learn something practical might be my answer to your question.
Okay.
No, that is too vague.
No, but that is a really good piece of advice. And that, that spans everything from learn how to fix a bicycle to learn a little bit about how software works to, knit a sweater or sew a shirt or
you're saying,
I don't know.
It's going to get harder to make the decision to acknowledge that and start to lean into it, even though it is something that you don't know how to do now and there will be work involved in learning that. I think whatever anyone can learn in a direction of community self-reliance is going to be helpful.
Okay, that's an optimistic thought, but I think the other thing here is it also just gives you an appreciation for what's involved in making and operating the things that we use and that we just take for granted. So that's also a really useful perspective to have, even if you don't end up needing it because the world melts down. And it
Knock on
also,
wood. Fingers
it
crossed.
also, but it also gives you a little bit of control over things and means you don't have to be as stalked by advertising or, left to the mercy of Google or Microsoft or Tesla or any of these other big companies. So I'll go ahead and end it here. So thank you very much. This has been an interesting conversation, lots of food for thought. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's a wrap. Your mission now is to get yourself a copy of Michael's book, The Jaguar Mask, from Solarpunk Press, because it sounds like it would be a really fun and super interesting novel to read. And don't forget to support us, because we need your support. Join our Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click like on our videos. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel, Kroon, and Christina de Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay solarpunk.